Hi, my name is Chris, aka The Philosopher's Games, and today I want to discuss the recently released Gollum game, The Lord of the Rings Gollum as it's officially called, developed by Daedalic Entertainment. I try to keep this mostly spoiler-free and only show you footage of the, let's say, first 3 chapters. If you follow my main channel, you have probably seen the live stream where I played this game for like 2.5 hours for the very first time and then gave you my first impressions. And those were not that negative initially, though I of course was aware that this won't be the greatest game ever. However, now that I played through the game, also with making a let's play in mind on YouTube where I focus basically on the lore and the references in the game compared to the books, I kind of understand where those low review scores are coming from. That is what I want to talk about in this review, and I won't even focus much on the technical side of things. I think Jedi Survivor released in a far worse technical state. Though I heard some people had like 120 crashes in this game and so on. I had not a single one, so it seems like there are configurations where this can run, and maybe I just got very lucky, and with Jedi Survivor I got very unlucky. I would say the frame rate in this game is also not great, but the issues are clearly not as bad as with Jedi Survivor, in my opinion, from a technical side of things, at least with the Day 1 patch installed. Keep this in mind. I played it with the Day 1 patch, not without it, and probably that would have been a far worse experience. However, I think the core problems of this game are not technical issues. The core problems are definitely on the gameplay side of things. What you primarily do in this game are kind of 4 things. First of all, and that is very present in the game, platforming. So climbing up, going from A to B, finding ways how to get to the other side of an abyss or something like this. Second, stealthing. So you have to get past some enemies that are not supposed to see you. So you have to find sneaky ways to get to a certain point without being seen. Third, you have to do puzzles in the game to, for example, open a door, which are relatively rare though in the game. And last, you have this little mini game where you can decide for one outcome or another, who to trust, who to betray, and this has sometimes consequences in the story, which I think is one of the more interesting mechanics of this game, to be honest. If you now make a game like this, your stealthing and platforming better be absolutely fantastic, and that is unfortunately where the game does not fully delivers. The problem is, it's maybe okayish, and okayish can't carry this game. The game already has a very tough hill to climb. They, for example, don't have the Peter Jackson license, so they can't use the designs of the Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. They can't just hire Andy Serkis and have the Gollum that we know in the game. That are simply things they had to reinvent, and that is really tough with Lord of the Rings because the films are so incredibly iconic. Then the choice of Gollum as the main character is often criticized, even though I know and also think that Gollum is a very interesting character and that a game about Gollum could absolutely have worked. It's still something you have to convince people that it's actually great. And if now the gameplay is just okayish and often very outdated, it is a recipe for a disaster, and that is exactly what we see here. But let us look a little bit deeper into this. It maybe sounds strange, but when I played the Gollum game, I often thought to myself, why was Jedi Survivor, another game that I'm currently reviewing in the background, was so much more fun when it comes to its platforming than this game? And it's very interesting to compare those 2 games. Of course, the Gollum game is more almost like an indie game, or a AA or maybe only 1A game, and Jedi Survivor is clearly a AAA game on a much higher budget. But I think gameplay-wise, you can definitely make some comparisons, because this is more about design decisions and some design ideas. For example, both games have one specific way how to solve their platforming sections. That is, for example, different in a game like the new Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, where you have basically all kinds of possibilities to solve a problem. You can build a bridge, you can fly over it, and so on and so forth. This is not how the Gollum game and Jedi Survivor are designed. It's simply a different design philosophy, a different approach to platforming, and that is not a bad thing. Both Jedi Survivor and the Gollum game, for example, highlight climbable walls in certain ways, or for example color ledges differently, so you can cling onto those. Not always, but often. Though I have to admit Jedi Survivor does this far more elegantly and it feels more organic and natural than what the Gollum game does. And this idea is very old already, and as a result can feel quite outdated if not implemented very organically into the level design. And on top of that, you ask yourself the question, why would the Dark Lord Sauron order his orcs that they paint all the ledges and walls in the depths of Barad-dûr, so the player knows where to go? That makes no sense, and it's always a very gamey solution to highlight where the player has to go. Here the Gollum game is not that great, and that might add to it feeling a bit outdated in its design approach. Though, to be fair, you definitely see an effort to make it look more natural when it comes to climbable walls and surfaces. In my opinion, the basic design idea behind highlighting or color coding the platforming paths is to create a flow so that the platforming feels fast-paced, maybe even like in an action movie, and sometimes you can combine this very well with cool movement options like grappling hooks, double jumps, air dashes, wall running, all sorts of things. But the idea behind it is not to let the player guess where to go next. That would be a different approach and kill the flow. Jedi Survivor does this, in my opinion, relatively well, at least most of the time, and it's very generous with its platforming. But for the Gollum game, the developers made some very strange design decisions that go completely against this approach, against the idea of flow in platforming. For example, take those horizontal poles you can jump onto and swing to jump from one to another. Those I also find mostly very annoying, and they exist in both games, interestingly. In the Gollum game, you need a lot of swinging to get enough momentum to fly to another, and this makes it feel very clunky. Of course, often you can just immediately jump again after the first time you cling onto a pole and already have maximum momentum. This works in both games, but there are some edge cases depending on, I don't know, angle and other factors where this is not the case, and then you have to do the swinging, which kills the flow and let you wait. That's also a reason why I don't really like these annoying poles, but those feel clunky in both games, but Gollum just needs the extra amount of swinging to get the maximum amount of momentum, which just kills the flow even further and feels very clunky, even more clunky than in Jedi Survivor, which is very impressive. On top of that, you have very little air control over Gollum. So Gollum has superhuman jumping power. It seems he can just jump 10 meters far and 3 meters high, almost like Cal Kestis in Jedi Survivor. But you can't change your direction much mid-air, which is, I guess, more realistic, but also in a lot of situations less fun. In this context, you also are very limited in controlling your jump distance. It's very frustrating if you just fly over the platform you planned on landing and just fall into the abyss behind it. This makes platforming in the Gollum game very clunky. In my opinion, it always feels better if you can control the jump distance from the point when you press the jump button, and then in addition fine-tune it further mid-air. This was already a thing in Super Mario Bros. From 1985 and even potentially before that, and in the Gollum game you just always do a full jump. Another huge difference is how both games handle failure. What happens if you fall to your death? In Jedi Survivor, if you fall to your death, the game has saved the last position your character could safely stand on, so was not in a falling state. And when you die, you lose a little bit of health and are just teleported back there. So you don't have to redo everything. This happens dynamically. In the Gollum game, that is not the case. There, the developers set manually checkpoints, and if you die, you are set back to those. To be fair, those are set very generously though, and were most of the time not an issue. Though there were some sections where I wondered, wait, here's no checkpoint? And also noticed that if you are detected by enemies and chased by them, so let's call it in combat, though there is no real combat in the game, you potentially could skip checkpoints, it seems. But I'm not 100% sure on that. However, this is still less convenient than what Jedi Survivor does. And especially in a game where sometimes it is a bit clunky and you fall to your death because your character does not grab a ledge or you just overshoot the platform you want to jump on or other weird interactions, it becomes really frustrating because nothing is more frustrating than dying. It feels like it was not your fault and then you have to redo all of this again. Of course, if you design something like this, it adds intensity to the platforming when something is on the line. You don't want to make all the stuff you have done before again. But if you choose this design approach, then your platforming has to be really good because nothing, as said, feels more frustrating than dying, and it feels like it wasn't your fault because you are not 100% in control of the game, if that makes sense. Speaking of clunky, wall running. In this game you can also wall run like in Jedi Survivor. How it works here though is you hold down the sprint button and move towards the wall, and then the wall running starts and ends automatically. Unfortunately, it feels like you have absolutely zero control over it, and that is, in my opinion, the reason why it feels so clunky. In Jedi Survivor you have to jump against the wall, and when the character touches it, then the wall running starts automatically. And this gives you so much more control over it, because you decide when the wall running starts and at which height it starts. And at the end, you have better air control anyway, so if you jump off it, you can also precisely control where the character will land. On top of that, you have a double jump, and if you have at least not spent that yet, you have in theory the option to just jump back where you came from with it and basically save the situation. Though if you would fall down to your death, it's not a problem because you would respawn there anyway and just lose a bit of health, which even you can deactivate in the options menu anyway. So it feels just you are much more in control of this wall running, and as a result, wall running in Jedi Fallen Order and also Jedi Survivor is a lot of fun, but not in the Gollum game. There it's like running towards a dead end and pray that the interaction with the wall is working. And maybe if you're a little bit too far away from the wall, it doesn't work and you just fall down to your death and start at the last checkpoint. It is not that great, and if you now are scared and stop in front of every wall running section if you are perfectly aligned and double check if you have enough stamina, we talk about that in a moment, then this also kills the flow of the game, which is very unfortunate again. In this context, it's also interesting that Gollum always does so-called full jumps, so he always jumps the maximum amount of distance if you press a jump button into the height, and also after wall runs, which can lead you jumping off a platform, which again adds to the clunky feeling and makes you feel like you have less control over the character. And then in combination with starting at the last checkpoint, it can lead to frustration. Speaking of full jumps, if you climb up a ladder and press jump, Gollum just jumps 2 meters up into the air, above the platform you want to climb on. But you can't press forward to land on the platform. He will just fall down and hold on back to the ladder, like there's an invisible wall. I think you can maybe control to the left and right and then fall down to your death, but there are maybe a few ladders in the game where it works, jumping up. Maybe it has to do with the angle of the ladder, but other than that you have basically no other option than to see the climbing up animation of Gollum, which again slows down the climb, kills the flow a little bit. And this just adds to the clunky feeling of the game. And I could just continue for quite some time here with things that aren't really working well together in the game. It is a legitimate approach to make climbing up something a puzzle, so we have to figure out the exact route it takes to get up there safely. But then, in this design approach, you wouldn't highlight where you have to go. This would contradict this design approach, and I think it was also clearly not meant to be the design approach in this game, because there are even cutscenes where the camera flies through the level and it shows you where to go. So finding the way as a puzzle is definitely not what the Gollum game wants to do. So the question is, why did they choose this highlight approach, and why did they put in so many elements into this game that kind of contradicts the highlight approach and kills the flow of the platforming? And I think the answer to this might be that they expected that a lot of players might get the game who are not that deep into gaming, who are not that experienced with platforming and so on. I think though, they could have solved or achieved something similar with just an accessibility option that blends in these highlight passes, and for all the other players they could have just made an option to disable it to make it more interesting, and then maybe even go for a completely different approach. That also would have been a possibility. There's also this Gollum vision in the game that also highlights where to go next. So in my opinion, there would be definitely options for the developers to solve this without watering down the highlight approach, in my opinion. And as said, it's not the only thing. It's not just that the highlight approach is watered down and the flow isn't great. It just feels clunky, and that is the biggest problem, in my opinion, of the platforming part. To maybe say something positive, I also mentioned stamina before in the game. And I think that is an interesting addition to the game, to be honest, because when you climb along a ledge and Gollum loses foothold, so he has to hold only to the ledge with his hands, he loses stamina. If he runs out of stamina there, then he falls down. And this adds urgency to this particular climbing, so you have to kind of make haste to get there, to get to a place where you have footholding again, and then your stamina bar will refill. I think that is a very nice addition, and we also see this in other games like the Zelda game, though they have a completely different approach to platforming, to be fair. However, here I think it fits. What I find sometimes a bit strange is that you always lose stamina when running. I mean, it kind of makes sense, of course, but the problem is when you, for example, have to run to make a jump and maybe make another jump where you need to run, and you just do this in one go, you eat up a lot of your stamina already, and then you have to do a wall run section, for example. But now you have to stop and regain your stamina before you can go there, which again kills the flow of it. I'm not sure how you can solve this issue. Either give Gollum a little bit more stamina would be one option, or maybe make it like an Elden Ring, where you only lose stamina when you are in combat. So when Gollum gets detected, he loses stamina, and then you have the urgency to manage it, and you can't run away that easily from enemies. I also noticed there's one section where Gollum needs to run away, and there he can sprint much longer than he normally could. It's very noticeable. So it seems like the game also adjusts the amount of stamina here at times when needed, which is interesting to see, but feels a bit inconsistent. And then there are these sections where Gollum has to walk from A to B. Like, for example, he often awakes in a cell and then has to go somewhere. And you can sprint often on the way, but your sprinting time is so short that it doesn't really feel it's worth it. Like, it feels like stamina management where it doesn't really need to be. Just either give him a bigger stamina bar in these particular sections so I can get faster from A to B, or let Gollum simply not use any stamina there at all, which would be preferred. On top of that, there are sometimes these sections where you have to follow an NPC, and of course you can't sprint there at all, you can't accelerate it. At least there's often dialogue on the way, but if it stops, then it becomes awkwardly walking behind some NPC with weird walking animations. So combine these with these sections where you have to follow somebody unseen, and if you get seen, you instantly fail and have to load the last checkpoint. And you see that some of this is just overstaying its welcome, and it's not very fun. It's sometimes even frustrating or boring. And that is not good in a video game if it feels boring at times. Did we talk about stealthing in this game? Unfortunately, it's very basic and is lacking complexity. I found it so uninteresting and boring that I tried to avoid it as much as I could. So I would just run through everything and just don't care if the orcs see me or not. I just ran past them and tried to be gone. And it was most of the time pretty easy to do so, I have to admit. Some sections though were a bit frustrating if you try them like this and required a few retries. But it was at least more interesting than actually stealthing. I'm not big into stealth games, I should say here, but it's always like there are some predefined dark spots where you are basically invisible. So you have to find those. They are extra black and there's even a little bit of mist there. Sometimes the enemies have lights and they can make this disappear, but if that is not the case, you are practically invisible and often feels completely out of place and like the enemies are either blind or completely brain dead, which the enemies actually are. And then you slowly creep from one dark shadow to the other and have to wait for these incredibly slow patrolling paths and so on and so forth. Then sometimes there is somebody just watching and you have to throw a stone to distract him. And of course, when you aim with a stone, you can't move Gollum anymore. I think the 1990s have just called and they want their game design back. Like, how is it possible that a game in 2023 does not allow you to aim and move at the same time? I don't know how this is even possible, but it's a terrible idea. Because sometimes you have to readjust the position of Gollum because something is in the trajectory of the stone and you just have to fine-tune his position a little bit. That this is not possible is just... let's not talk about the stealthing anymore. And this brings us to the story, and I try to keep this as spoiler-free as possible. But overall, I felt like, and this sounds very strange, the game was too little about Gollum and too much about other characters having busy work to do for Gollum. Like, most of the time, it's you doing busy work for others. Gollum sometimes feels like a side character in his own game, and that is another problem why this game sometimes is not that interesting, because there are new not canon characters that they of course had to invent, and don't get me wrong, of course they have to invent characters for a game like this, but it was more about them and their story, and Gollum was somehow tied into this, entangled into this, but the game was not really putting a focus on Gollum himself. And then he does some tasks for them, and this helps him as well, so he can escape at the end. And that is very often the basic structure of how the story is told in this game. It's really hard to describe, but let's just imagine Frodo and Sam leave the Shire, and then Sam says, "I'm hungry." And then Frodo goes alone on a mission where he climbs up some mountains and trees and whatnot and brings back an apple and some berries. And then they move on, and then Sam says, "Oh no, I lost my water bottle." And then Frodo again sneaks into some village and tries to not be seen there, climbs up some roofs, sneaks into a house, steals a water bottle and comes back to Sam. And this is not all that interesting often, even though the game really tries to at times focus on Gollum and tries to, at these tasks and friendships that he potentially develops or not, to develop his character into a certain direction that might fit into the story later. So I can't say the game does not try this, but I think it is just often too busy with other stuff that's not that interesting. And I have to admit, I also really can't say how they could have done this better. I think things work a little bit better story-wise in the Mirkwood section for the most part, because there's a character that talks to Gollum even when he's climbing and doing some stuff, so there's more interaction besides Gollum talking to himself or simply not talking at all. And here they can maybe develop him a little bit further. That was, I think, that was kind of a smart idea. Still, there you also do a lot of busy work for characters that are not that important or interesting in the greater context of Tolkien's universe. And Gollum is an iconic character in the greater context of Tolkien's universe. So it's so strange that he is doomed to do busy work for others all the time. I feel like for an obsessed character like him finding clues where Bilbo Baggins went, where the One Ring might be, where the Shire is, that is a thing the game should have focused on much more, in my opinion. It might sound stupid, but like Detective Gollum is figuring things out, something like that. But the game focuses just on small areas where we don't know what exactly happened in this time, and then make up stories where Gollum has to do a lot of busy work to get out of there again, even though that is not that interesting. Further, the game portrays Gollum's escape differently than what Tolkien wrote in one of his texts published in Unfinished Tales. In the game, Gollum escapes kind of himself from Mordor. In the book, Sauron sets him free. Quote, "He, Sauron, did not trust Gollum, for he divined something indomitable in him, which could not be overcome even by the shadow of fear, except by destroying him. But Sauron perceived the depths of Gollum's malice towards those that had robbed him, and guessing that he would go in search of them to avenge himself, Sauron hoped that his spies would thus be led to the ring." Of course, this quote is from Unfinished Tales, and the developers had no license for Unfinished Tales, but I still think they could have done something that is more similar to that than how they actually portrayed it in the game. Of course, in the game, it's also hinted at that Sauron potentially had influence at Gollum surviving his time in Barad-dûr, but I still think there's a huge difference between how the game portrayed it and how I imagined it reading those lines. overall, I think the story had its moments, and there are some interesting choices you can make in the game as well that put him more on one path or the other. I think that works fairly well, but I think the good elements are surrounded by too many elements that don't matter too much or just distract too much from what should matter when you tell a story about Gollum. And there's too much busy work, and the gameplay doesn't carry the game. For book fans, there are some references which I found interesting, or some ideas in the book which I said, okay, that's nice. For example, it makes sense that from Gollum's perspective, Thranduil is always called Elven King, because in the original Hobbit book from 1937, the character Thranduil did not exist yet. He was invented later for the Lord of the Rings lore, and as a result, he was just called Elven King. It's even more complicated than this, to be fair. There are definitely some cool elements in the game, and it feels like the developers respect the books and Tolkien's works and try to stick close to the books for the most part. There were some elements in the game that felt a little bit too magic for Tolkien's universe, especially in the realm of Thranduil and so on. It's not that big of a deal, but I kind of noticed it, and at least for my personal taste, it was, especially at the end, a little bit too much of that. Then the collectibles, so there are some items in the game you can find, and Gollum shortly comments on them, and sometimes there might be a line in the book or so they reference or not. I didn't find them too interesting, I have to admit, compared to, for example, how Shadow of Mordor did the similar thing, where you had some cool references here and there. For example, the two blue wizards were referenced, or a character from the Silmarillion called Gollum. So it was kind of interesting there to figure out what was going on there. I didn't feel the urge to think more or dive deeper into the collectibles in this game. What I also want to positively highlight is the soundtrack of the game. I think that overall is pretty great, so shoutouts to the composer. There's not much I can complain there, and it felt very Lord of the Rings-like, so I guess mission accomplished there by the composer. Another thing that was criticized quite a bit was the DLC policy of the game. There are several Day 1 DLCs, and all of them are included in the so-called Precious Edition, which costs $10 more, but the combined costs of all the DLCs is of course bigger than $10, so it's kind of worth getting this edition. However, some complained that some of these DLCs should be just in the base game, and I would agree on this. For example, the Lore Companion should be just in the base game and not be a DLC. Like in the game you can click on, or in the main menu you can click on it, and then you have some entries and it gives you in a text form different lore background information of elements you see and find in the game. That's pretty nice to have, and it's pretty standard in a lot of games, so it seems strange that this game charges extra for it or just forces you to get the Precious Edition for this very basic feature. That indeed is a criticism I share and agree on. There's also the soundtrack and emotes pack, and yeah, I can see that this is potentially, especially the soundtrack, is DLC or in a higher upgraded edition. That's not too unusual. Another DLC that got quite heavily criticized is the Sindarin voice-over DLC. Sindarin is one of the main languages of the elves in Tolkien's world, and the elves in the game are expected to speak Sindarin. And of course, this sounds pretty bad when, like, the elf speaking Sindarin is behind a paywall. But if you read the description of this, you can see that it's just additional voice lines. So I tested this out a little bit. And even if you have it deactivated, and I deactivated it inside the game, inside the main menu, and I even deactivated it and tested it when it's deactivated inside of Steam itself. And it made no difference. I could not find a single additional voice line, to be honest, though I didn't play through the whole elf section with this deactivated. I just played like half an hour or something like this. And every passage I remembered where elves spoke Sindarin, they still spoke Sindarin there. So even without the DLC, elves still speak Sindarin in the game, so I think this criticism is a bit blown out of proportion. Though maybe marketing-wise, the wording of Sindarin voiceover is a bit unfortunate. They really should have just said additional Sindarin or something like this. I guess that would have been better in this context versus people just thinking, okay, I'm missing out if I don't have this DLC, and that feels unfair. It should be in the base game, which I would agree on. But as said, this seems to really just be some additional voice lines. And this leads me to my conclusion. I have to say, unfortunately, I can't recommend this game. And I think even with patches, when some of the technical issues would be ironed out, I could still not recommend the game. The flaws are just too deep in this game, and they would have to redo a lot of things and rework a lot of game mechanics, and I don't see this happening anytime soon. Like, even if they were willing to reduce some of this, it's just not that great. They are simply better games. Especially the base version of this game costs €50, I assume $50, and the Precious Edition is $10 more, so 60. And at this price tag, it's basically in competition with like the Zelda game, with some other AAA games that you can get, and it's not even close. Like, these games are not even in the same galaxy. It's just such a big difference. The low scores are unfortunately justified for this game. And even if the game would be cheaper, like let's say it would cost $20 and just get Styx, which is a far better stealth game, it's really at a rough spot. Like, it would need to improve quite a bit. But I guess at a $20 price tag or something, you could definitely say as a fan, maybe you could try it out. And even with that, it just remains a below average game. And for even $20, you can just get far better games than this. It's the unfortunate truth, and especially in 2023, where so many great games come out, even though some of them also have quite a bit of technical issues. And I still would say that the Jedi Survivor release was worse than the release of this game from a technical perspective. But Jedi Survivor is simply the far, far better game compared to this. I really think every 3 out of 10, 4 out of 10 for this game is unfortunately justified. And this basically ends my video. If you want to see me play through this game with some lore commentary, comparing it to the Lord of the Rings books, then check my main channel and maybe press the subscribe button plus the annoying bell. Leave a like and a comment, that would be much appreciated. I'm very curious how your perception of the game is, especially if you have played it, and if you can relate to some of my criticism here, let me know that in the comments. Shoutouts to all the people here supporting my channel. I would say thank you for watching, and see you people next time. Goodbye.